Well, Valsa Rovan show he come and Gort na Móna show and Kugu lecht in sa shraith the leachtaí a hosaí a mianar. Thomas and show on Kelly Iani or Nidjihis. Agus is shraith leachtaí iad show at a Kurktu a mask of football. Thomas Giri leachtanna eggsula a Iami for star na Huron. For do the pobail na Huron. For do the strahasi eggsula a Vian Ogin. Agus midge a gold to show. Mark Cudge the actus at how much agree with that rare for doing edges August an edges show of a one heads of football because I see and ask her Rin Surrey you're like argue at horse station dirt made he grocery seer and ask her just telling Claire tried to pay me and I was telling her that it's free as education. No education should be. If everyone thought like that it would be great. So I want to welcome us all here to Gort na Móna. This is a joint project between Gort na Móna Culture and Community Subcommittee and Ghlór na Móna, which is an Upper Springfield Irish Language organisation, and this lecture series is free. It's a community lecture series, and we'll have Kieran O'Brien here who's going to.
There's me thinking I was going to get a big fee.
Well, we'll have Kieran O'Brien who'll make sure that every lecture gets spread far and wide on the internet. So come on, get Kieran this chat. So Inez needs no introduction. As we know, this is Inez McCormack. I know she absolutely despises bios. So I'll give her a wee bio anyway.
I don't know.
Inez is a renowned human rights and trade union activist at 40-year stand, former head of Unison, also the first ever female president of the Irish Congress and Trade Union. She played a leading role in training the McBride Principles for Fair Employment in the North of Ireland after a long campaign. Still works across the world with human rights activists and is the chairperson of the PPR project and participation in the Practice of Rights project in North Belfast, which uses human rights as a tool to empower marginalised communities to campaign on their own behalf. So the title of the talk itself is Equality and Human Rights, Fighting Injustice from Below. So the bio itself that was stuck in the Town News mentioned Meryl Streep and plays in Hollywood and all, but sure we'll leave that out. We'll get straight on. We'll get straight on to that. So Bill Bussell, we're on the then. If people could put their phones on silent as well, just in case the.
I don't know. I'm just going to try and start with. Can you hear me at the back? Okay.
I can hear you. Don't worry about them.
I can tell you're just an activist from anywhere. I'm going to just try and do a couple of things from my own background and history, and then some lessons of struggle, if you like, and then open it up because that appears to be the, I think, most useful. But I think also. I just want to start with two little things. One of the reasons I'm sitting here, I'm Pargin, currently chairing the PPR project, is the input of two people with a long history of struggle in this community. And one's Mary Enright. And when we were talking about this, and is this possible? And Mary said, all you need is a couple of people who are determined to oppose what's wrong, and you can take anything from there. And that's roughly where I would actually build the politics from. And the second thing is when I said to Terry, do you think this idea, this was 4 or 5 years, will get off the ground? And he said, well, it will if you make it. So in a sense, that's where this starts from. You know, change, you don't wait for change to happen, and you don't wait for the right circumstances. Because the people who are at the hard end never have the right circumstances. And so I'm just going to give a little example before I go into my work, my background, to tell you just a little bit of a struggle I'm just currently involved in South Africa, India and Brazil. And they are women street traders, women market vendors, who get up in the morning and they don't know what the day is going to bring, either in food, or beatings up, or rape, or attacks, and that's their history every day. And part of the work that I've involved, there's an organisation called StreetNet International, which is an attempt by some of the women traders to organise, and what they have done is created alliances across several countries In India, there's an extraordinary organisation of women that started about 20 years ago with around market vendors, which I think they had 7 women when they started. There's now 600,000 of them, including waste pickers in the Gobi Desert. So, in a sense, these are the people who organise from the fact that they have nothing. Nobody is on their side except them. Right? And the reason that I got involved was that when somebody had put me in touch with them in South Africa a few years ago, and the World Cup had just been announced, the FIFA World Cup had just been announced going to South Africa, and there was a very clear understanding by the market vendors that they were likely to be swept off the streets. And for example, in the city of Durban at the moment, which is run by a guy who was in jail when he fought apartheid, 400 homeless children have been lifted off the streets and put in a prison camp. The women market vendors have been swept off because of the FIFA conditions around the stadiums and the fan parks. There's total exclusion from anything other than approved vendors, and to be an approved vendor of any product you have to have 20,000 rands, and secondly you have to sell a commercial product. Well, the majority of the food vendors sell the bits of food they can find, make something off them, get a wage that day and whatever. So when they met them, I met them initially because of my work with pension funds, which came out of the McBride campaign, and just thinking kind of simple thoughts about how could you put pressure on FIFA. But actually, again, you start where people are, and really what they wanted, which was, because these are people with strategies, 10 strategies a day, not one strategy, right? What they wanted was a way forward, that the games would be used, if possible, that they get some benefit from it, but they're fairly realistic about power. But what they wanted, and this is the core to the work, my own work approach, is that out of the games, if anything happened, they might get a bit of money, they might get income. What they'd like to be is not hungry for the month of June. They'd like their children not to be hungry. That was reasonable demand. But what they would also like is to get negotiating forums in every one of the municipalities where the games are taking place that are there when the games have gone. So they have a seat at the table to work out how to get a licence, how to get protection, how to get involved. So in a sense, these are people who understand that as soon as you put your head above the parapet, you're going to get it chopped off because you have no worth. So, and secondly, what they understand are strategies that if you go for something, it needs to link into the longer term. Right? Now, I've been involved, and it seems such a simple thing to say to FIFA and to say to the South African government, that how do you look at the impact of international sports events to ensure that the outcome at least benefits the most marginalised and certainly doesn't damage them? And it's a question for 3 years that has not been answered. They have built an extraordinary campaign. Those of you who were at the conference a week ago, the conference on Friday that Mary Robinson was at, the reason she and I disappeared was that we were constructing a letter from her and a number of kind of leading world figures to FIFA saying it's only 1 month to the games. The least you can do is actually provide the negotiating forums, because the problem is, as soon as you start asking the question, you find out the contracts between FIFA and the nation states. You find out that there's deals done with Coca-Cola, all the brand names, all the rest of it. So you're not going to unstitch it all in a day, right? But what they wanted unstitched, and the pressure now, is to be visible. And we've managed to get international press in 3 days, virtually all over the world. And it's beginning to get some results now. It'll get very little results. But what their single thing is, they're being offered now a wee bit of this and a wee bit of that. And they'll say, we'll take a wee bit of this and we'll take a wee bit of that, but we're not going to take it unless we get a negotiating forum. Right? So the message out of that is that, going back to Mary's point, you know, if you're determined to oppose a wrong, you can do it. There is no right time to argue for change. And if you live in an invisible world with no space, you know that. And secondly, once you start fighting for space, how do you create allies that help you put the boot on the other foot? So the question is not why they should have to prove why they should be heard or why they should actually be able to bargain, but that FIFA and the government has to prove why they shouldn't, right? And that's Mary's job, that's my job, and other people's job, is not to beg in their behalf, but to question on their behalf why they're not being given space. And that really sums up their negotiating strategy. And the reason I'm doing it is to make the point, you know, there's no right time to take action. And I became involved in that because I suppose I would have been known through the McBride Principles campaign and also through work I'd have done here and in other countries with women who would be like them, invisible. And what I was deemed to be, and this is the very important thing, I was deemed to be useful, not important. Right? And that really is at the heart of it, you know. Mary Robinson's an iconic world figure, and she understood what she needed to be in the next month is to be of use, of service. So the question was, what use could we be, not how important we were. And if we have an alleged importance, how can that importance be put at use? Right? So that's the kind of thing that's been kind of dominating my mind and my work for the last couple of months. And I suppose that just brings into, if I'm going to talk about the past a little, and I suppose the experiences of my own working life, which have either been around, coincided with the civil rights movement, the Burn Tulip March, and the issues around equality and discrimination. And also in my day job, organised around the battles of women to become visible, and the fight eventually against Thatcherism, but also the fights within the trade union movement and in forums, whether it was Thatcherism or whatever form, is that the people or women who were cleaners or home helps were regarded as shit. They were regarded as of no account. So the sense again, there's no right time for action, you know. So those two struggles really form most of my life and they inform most of my thinking. There were parallel struggles, but I'm one person, so the lessons and mistakes you learn from one struggle you put to the other, and vice versa, you know. You try and bury the mistakes as much as you can, and there was a lot of them. There was a lot of them, right? But I suppose if I have to kind of pull out a couple of understandings or insights, if you like, from those struggles, is that there's a very brutal struggle to name an issue. It takes a very brutal struggle for people who are invisible to be named or an issue to be unveiled. They can be invisible, like cleaners. I mean, I told this story to us, it's absolutely true. You can be invisible like hospital cleaners when I remember administrators or doctors literally tripping over the cleaners in the corridor. Not because they were being rude, they physically didn't see them. Well, after they had been organised for a while, they saw them because they would bite them if they tried to stand over them. But that doesn't happen immediately, right? But so in terms of naming an issue, you can't fight discrimination against women if you don't name the issues. You can't fight discrimination against religion, because the other invisibility in the North is either at that stage was the invisibility of the poor, specifically women, and the unpopularity which caused the invisibility of Catholics, especially lower paid Catholics. Yes, there are lower paid Protestants, or not lower paid, sorry, disadvantaged, dispossessed Protestants, but disproportionately, it was hugely, and still is, hugely Catholic. To name that issue was regarded as being of offence. It was regarded as giving support to the war. It was regarded as utterly unacceptable. I make the hard, cold point. To name the issue now is regarded as damaging the peace. Right? It is always unpopular and unacceptable to name the issue. And if you don't name the issue, it can't be tackled. And that's, it may sound, I mean, I was in the States recently talking to a number of Afro-Americans about racism, and each of us were talking what we brought to the table in terms of our experiences, and I used this issue, and there was a kind of silence. And one Afro-American woman said to me, you know, there's still a smell when you say it in the States. She said, we can talk about anything but. We can talk about tackling it, we can talk whether we opposed it, we can talk about the Civil War, we can talk about everything. But we actually say, in fact, the issue, and we name the facts, statistics, figures, all the rest of it, and just name it coldly, there is still the smell. There's still a smell in Northern Ireland that you don't say it at the dinner table, that you don't say it at the table, right? There's still, when you raise the issue around women, this thing that we were talking about anymore, feminism, that's yesterday, you know. Well, you know, if it's yesterday, then why aren't we in a slightly different condition, right? So the first point I'd make is that the brutal struggle to name it, to name the issue, is the first, if you like, step in any battle for change. Secondly, that if the people who are affected aren't involved in that struggle for it to be named, then you will win the day, maybe, if you're lucky. You might win the day, you might win a battle, but power will regroup the following day. Because if the people involved, I mean, I'll just give you simple examples to make a very obvious point. We had women members took equal pay cases, affecting, the results of which would affect hundreds of thousands of women. Took 12 years in court. And they didn't fill in the forms, hundreds of them, thousands of them, because they thought they were going to get equal pay. What it did for them, and this is the second important point, it shifted the burden of proof. I don't mean the legal argument. I mean the simple point that people understood by challenging the equal pay case. They understood that the pay that they received, the conditions in which they worked, and the value in which they held were not them, were not because of who they were. And you need, I suppose, to understand very clearly that if you haven't lived in the absence of right, then you don't understand that the absence of right is humiliation and a sense of powerlessness, a sense that you can't shout or you can't say no. Right? So in a sense, that battle around equal pay would have probably, once we won every legal battle, as one of the women said, we come out of the court, I think after the 5th court case, which we'd won, and they appealed again just to keep it going. She says, don't they spend a fucking lot of money keeping us poor? And she just looked, and she said, look at them expensive grey suits on either side. They don't spend an awful lot of fucking money keeping us poor. And she was absolutely right, you know. She was the same woman who wouldn't have said, boo to a goose. But what the battle around that was mobilised her sense of herself. And as she said, you couldn't have paid her to do it. In fact, she wouldn't have taken the money, even if you had tried to pay her to do it. She came out of court, not that time, but another court case was asked, you know, well, you've won in there, but they're going to appeal, so have you won? She says, well, I don't know whether we're going to win in there, but I won in here. Right? Now, I'm not romanticising that or eulogising that, but whatever struggle you're involved in, if you don't change, if that's the whole notion of right, it changes the sense that you are not the problem. Right? It's like that first line in the story of the play that you were talking about, doing a piece of work with women in North Belfast not many years ago, and reading them the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you know, basically thought, she's a nice woman, she's been around a long time and she means well, but she's nuts, right? And there's that kind of patient look on their face, you know, we'll listen to her, and then we get a cup of tea, right? And we got to the word inalienable, and I still stumble over it. I can never say it properly, right? And they said, what did you say? Alien? And they thought I'd been talking about aliens, so the thing kind of dissolved into a bit of a laugh, and I said, no. And they said, well, what does this mean? And I said, well, I mean, how do you get these human rights? And I said, well, there's a difference in getting them and the right to have them. And she said, well, how do you get the right to have them? And I said, you have them because you're a human being. They belong to you because you're a human being. And I mean, this story, it's absolutely a true story. Right? There was silence, complete silence. You know, I know as if I swear a lot, and my members swear a lot, but it's an absolutely true story. And there's silence, and they looked at each other, looked at me, and said, well, that's the best fucking kept secret in the world. But point made, right? That once someone believes that the notion of right to me is fundamentally most important because it enables people to change their sense of themselves. If you go from believing you are worthless, that you have a sense of right, then it changes your view of the power, right? Those women that we organised in that equal pay case became the women who started to challenge how supervisors treated them. They started challenging when cuts were made in terms of the level of cleanliness. They went from that to challenge the closure in the Royal of the maternity unit and the A&E unit. And some of you will remember old enough will remember those struggles. You remember thousands of them on the streets. And how they actually, those women who were regarded as no account, actually led the demonstration, which successfully held the A&E unit here, which successfully held the maternity unit here, which successfully changed the shape of provisions. That may not seem a great deal, but it was in the middle of Thatcherism, when nobody was on their side but themselves. And the only way they survived those strikes was on this road, and many roads like them in West Belfast, in small shops. People put sweetie jars out, and people put money in every week into those sweetie jars, and we collected them and took them on a Friday night to see how much money we could share out to the people who were in strike. Men who were on the boats at night every week, you know, the ferries going across, would take a collection every week from the bar and come on a Tuesday night, and they had used anything between 80 quid to 300 quid. We sustained that strike through the communities who'd less than the people who were on strike. And the story, which again is true, which is that we had been involved, or I had been involved in the campaign around Divis Flats, which again was permissible to treat people like animals, because who were they anyway? They were of no account. And we had been involved to change that nature, and it actually taught a lot of the lessons that led to the current campaign on Seven Towers. I think it was just totally accidentally one night we'd brought in, and I'll talk about it, we brought in alliances, international unions, pressure, all the rest of it. We'd survived the worst they could throw at us. And we worked out that actually we could actually keep on. They had worked out, and we had worked out that they couldn't beat us, but we'd also worked out we couldn't win. So we had to work out what a win was in a way that kept us going for a longer day. So I must have been down at something at Divis for some reason, because the following day I was due up at Stormont for another incessant discussion by these senior civil servants who were on your side, Agnes. We just really need to find a solution. These are the people who've been trying to kick it into the ground for 9 months, right? And I must have been saying something to the women, or the meeting I was at in Divis, and they said, what, you know, can we do anything? Because like, you were great with us. Can we do anything? And I said, well, like, if you come up tomorrow, like to the maybe lunchtime when we're going to be up doing the talks, and we're going to try and have television cameras and a wee bit of a street theatre or whatever outside to show that we're not giving in. 200 women with children walked out of Divis, marched up to the Royal, occupied the management offices, occupied the gates, and when the TV cameras came up to have an outrage of this, how could you have an outrage when there, you know, there's 3 squalling kids sitting on this massive desk of the manager and 2 women. Now the next thing, I know it's a wee funny story, but it's an absolute true story. This was all over, and we went through and we got not a win, what we got was a change in shape. We got a change in shape of how power would be exercised in relation to the employment of women cleaners. And we got a change in shape of how their rights would be recognised by revaluing the work that they were doing, right? That they'd be part of a team, not servants of a team, right? So it was a battle for the longer term. And it must have been down in Divis a month or so later or whatever, and they said, how are things going, love? It's over, isn't it? And I said, yes. And I said, yeah, and you were great. And they kind of looked at each other and said, Dennis, if you'd only told us that's what it took, we'd have been up months ago. You know, but do you get my point? Alliance is built to naming the issue, tackling it, but rooting the way that you tackle it in the belief that those who actually are excluded aren't excluded because there's something wrong with them. They're excluded because something was wrong with the system of governance that excludes them. And that you may remedy the wrong, if you're lucky, for a short time, but if you don't change the nature of the power relations either between a supervisor and a cleaner, between this community in West Belfast and the system of administrative governance that governs Northern Ireland, to the extent that the new statistics, is it NISRA, the Statistics Agency, yeah, have just announced, show that the figures for the wards here, patterns of socioeconomic deprivation, number 1 is White Rock, number 1 10 years ago was White Rock, number 1 20 years ago was White Rock, number 1 30 years was White Rock, number 4 40 years ago. Do you get my point? If you don't actually root your battle in whether it's going to produce the structural change, and secondly also if you don't root any of your battles in the people who are affected, they go on believing actually that they're the problem, and secondly they're open to then something that looks as if it's change but isn't. right? So the second thing then is, once you begin to, I suppose, implement change, I suppose most of my, the McBride campaign probably is, in one way, I would probably be most well known for the McBride campaign, because it became the battle which went to the heart of the state. But it was the same issue. You could and did describe alleged discrimination in the mid-80s by the government in their public statements. You could actually render invisible the economic and social realities of West Belfast, North Belfast, Derry, West Milan. You could render all of those invisible and be quite relaxed and comfortable about it. Because to raise the issue was either to be on the side of the gun or to be foolish or stupid. Now, what McBride did was actually take the power of pension funds and the power of an external force, and I suppose the core point that I'm making is you not only have to change power relationships by enabling the people most affected to be part of that battle, but in order to change those power relationships, you've got to remove them from the existing way of doing business, right? When we had the people, singers on strike in the Royal, we brought the communities in. We brought also a puzzled Cambridge economist who never really understood why he was on television, saying there's the figures that they produced, saying the costs are this, and there's my figures as one of the world's most famous economists, a mathematician who won the Turing Prize, etc., that says, I rang him out of the blue. I rang 10 other people out of the blue as well, and they all said no. He was the one who said yes, right? So he went on television with a piece of paper, right? He then came over, met some of the women members, and as he said, got sucked in for 20 years, right? Because I accidentally said to him one time, were you advising the Japanese government or something? And he said, no, and it was Japanese something or other. I said, did they pay? He said, yes, and it's the equivalent of £10,000 a day. I said, Jesus, we never paid you anything. He said, I was never offered. Point being that, again, you use skills or visible skills or external alliances, but they only are of any use if they help change the power relationship between the invisible and or the unpopular and the status quo. Their use is to actually challenge the nature of decision making, right? There is no point producing, there's no point producing an analysis of figures. There is one, really, God made it. It's only any use unless you put it to the service of the people who are fighting for the change, right? Second thing, I suppose, that the lesson to learn is how power regroups. If you just take religious inequality. Currently, at the moment, despite those 25 years of regarded as successful struggle, despite the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, currently at the moment 5 public bodies will admit openly that they do not collect figures or information on the basis of religious inequality. So therefore, the nature of inequality experienced by Catholics or nationalists in West Belfast, North Belfast, are written out of any of the public resources that are meant to tackle and change those realities. If you don't name it, you can't tackle it. If you write it out, it doesn't exist, right? Now, what makes it permissible after those kind of battles to be able to do this, right? What enables it to be permissible that the battles of those women that I described, the home helps, that you can rewrite a contract to not their rights to be employed, but their rights to be employed as and when, right? So you turn people from being human beings with workers, doing a decent job, looking after the elderly, to being functions of units who are told not to talk to the elderly people because you don't have time. 10 minutes to light the fires and clean the dinners. You don't talk to them. That's an instruction. You don't talk to them. Now, in a sense, again, unless you root that fight back, as we did in the struggle not only of the home helps, but of the clients they served, you then start to make visible the brutal realities. I suppose where I see it now, and this is, I'm not going to go on it because in a sense I don't see other than making other than a few points, you know, where I kind of see it now very visibly is that the current construct in the north is that there will be undoubtedly major cuts in benefits major cuts in services as a result of the Tory government. But unless any struggle is actually rooted in the realities of the people who are excluded, is expressed in the realities that actually are most important to them, it will be a rhetorical struggle against cuts. Because really, if you are an elderly person on little benefit at the moment living in West Belfast, it really doesn't matter a shit whether it's a Tory government or a Labour government or whatever, right? In a sense, if your realities, or if you are, for example, the other night, some people in the PPR project were in Lower Falls in the block of flats where the conditions are appalling, and they're trying to get them knocked down. If you're the women in Seven Towers who are living with sewage coming through the sinks, that didn't suddenly happen because of change of government. It happened because there wasn't a construct that recognised that small wrongs may be small to you if you're not living in humiliation. But small wrongs are only small to you if you're not interested in the people who actually experience them. They're huge to them. It is huge to you, as in the papers that donated in South Africa, if rats are biting the heads of your babies. Right? It's huge to you if there's sewage coming through the sinks and that's the condition your children are living in. Those are not small things. They're regarded as small things because they're not the big thing in relation to social housing and the nature of the waiting list. But you have to start in organising through the participation of those who are most affected, and that comes from listening to them. It comes from listening to a woman cleaner or a school meals worker telling you the fan is broken in the laundry, the fan is broken in the kitchen, the sweat is coming down their face, the floor is uneven, so therefore they trip. And if you don't start organising to change that, then you're organising about them, you're not organising from them. Because once you have actually changed that, once you've listened to them to change that, they have the confidence then to recognise you're not speaking about them, you're speaking from them, and the second trick is then that they start speaking for themselves. The women in Seven Towers, when some of the PPR people started to organise a couple of years ago, really thought people like Desi, etc., were very nice. But that was it. Right? It didn't make much sense to do more than that. Once they recognised that actually they were going to be there, they were going to listen, and the small stories came out. And those stories were the basis then which give the information on which to organise. And they could start organising because pigeon waste, because they were the experts. They could start organising on the sewage, because they were the experts. The mental health group could start, the people, families who'd lost their kids through suicide, could start organising on appointment cards, because they were the experts. Right? All you needed then was the various skills of people to serve the experts. The experts were the people on the hard end. That's the way I would argue that if you're talking about human rights and equality from the bottom up, it's not about an anecdotal romantic notion. Right? It's not a nice thing to do or a nice approach. Fundamentally, my life experience has taught me, unless you root change and the practicalities of change in the lives and expectations and possibilities and practicalities of those who need them, then the change, if it comes, will be change which makes you look good in winning a law, and God knows I've won enough of them. Right? I was partly responsible for the Sex Discrimination Act coming into Northern Ireland in the mid-1970s. I was largely responsible for shaping the Fair Employment Act. I was largely responsible for shaping the equality provisions in the Good Friday Agreement. Right? None of that matters a shit if you can't change the relationship between those women in the Seven Towers and the housing executive, that they have the right to be treated of respect in the way that they live. Secondly, that Catholic waiting lists are not 90, Catholics on waiting lists in North Belfast are not 90%, which they are, most of whom are women. And that can be got away. The change is as good as you get. I never underestimate, and this is, and I'm nearly repeating where I started, I never underestimate what it is to get a legislative change or a policy change. Because in doing so, you point the finger from the person who's been on the receiving end to the system. But one thing I understand completely, when the system is forced to change, the system doesn't give in. The system fights back, and it fights back viciously. And that can be a hospital management, it can be the Northern Ireland Civil Service, but I've yet to see a system that hasn't had accountability forced on it, that actually maintains change it has been forced to make, unless you keep the pressure going. And pressure doesn't keep going because of a few committed activists. pressures keep going when people see themselves differently and begin to act differently. Now, the jury is out on how you do that. Last week, Friday week ago, we had the conference, and we had Kamayani from India, who is from Bihar and is a leading member of a peasant and workers' struggle in rural areas where so-called millions of rupees were put into building local facilities, hospitals, canals, houses, all the rest of it. And of course, most of them never existed, right? And they're part of a major struggle to go around asking and finding out, holding public hearings, all the rest of it. They fought for a Freedom of Information Act, which may sound very boring, but for them to be able to force an unaccountable official to answer a question with manners was a huge victory. One of them got killed for it, most of them got beaten up for it, right? The second and even more outrageous thing was that they had to answer a question, but where the money went and who went it. And they showed this video in the university, showed this brilliant video, you know, and this kind of very irritated villager saying, "What canal?" Right? You know, there's down the money in the budget is gone on building a canal, and these puzzled villagers are saying to the "What canal? Where's the canal?" Right? Then they've been told it's been spent on building a kind of protection in certain areas for workers, and the guy is standing against it. He's poking his finger, you know, and his finger goes through the cement, and the wall falls apart. Right? So that, you know, in a sense, but the way that they mobilised was not a small number of elite people that fought for, you know, how to get smart answers and how to force answers. They actually have rooted it in the villagers. It has taken 10 years, 12 years to get to where they are now. And what she said, and we would say, quite honestly, in terms of the work that we're doing, and I think the Americans would say the same thing that we had there, the environmental people. We understand what it takes to get change. We understand what it takes to name it, and we understand the price that people pay to do that. We understand what it takes to implement it in enabling people to be part of making it. How to sustain implementation, how to sustain the battle for structural change is actually the real issue anywhere in the world today for people who are actually really fighting and arguing for it. There is no easy answer, but what you can do is actually A, say that is the issue, and secondly, make connections with other. I mean, we learned 2 tricks from Kamayani, and she learned a few from us. That'll do us for next week, right? Do you know what I mean? I don't mean that as facetiously as it sounds. There's ways of learning from others. The guys from the environmental argument in Seattle and the West Coast in the States are up to something which we thought was really cheeky. Like, you know, it was about how to put ordinances through councils. And we're thinking, well, I wonder could we do that in regeneration, right? I wonder could we do that? But fundamentally, all of those things are simply what they are. They're useful thoughts, they're useful smarts. They're fascinated by our use of experts, right? Because the experts aren't about being expert. The experts are about coming and saying, you see what they're doing, it's grand, right? You see what they're doing, it's right. Now why aren't you doing it, right? They're fascinated by those things, but all of those things remain only what they are, useful tactics for struggle. But if they're not rooted in enabling the people who need the struggle, need the change, to be part of it, then it doesn't last. And the real battle around all of this is how do you make change last?
Thanks very much.